"This is our future now, not yours," my daughter-in-law said as she lifted her wine glass and looked around the dining table like she had just announced something everyone already knew except me. My son Ethan didn't correct her. He didn't even look surprised. He simply lowered his eyes and took a sip of water. In that moment, surrounded by family photographs and memories that stretched back nearly 4 decades, I realized I was no longer sitting at my own table as a mother. I was sitting there as a guest whose invitation had quietly expired. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I was 71 years old when I learned that grief was not the hardest thing a woman could survive. Sometimes betrayal wears a familiar face and speaks in a calm voice across a dinner table. The dinner had been organized just 2 weeks after my husband Richard's memorial service. Friends from church had brought casseroles. Neighbors had sent sympathy cards. The flowers from the service were still sitting in crystal vases around the house. Their petals had started to curl at the edges, and somehow that felt appropriate. Everything in my life seemed to be fading at the same pace. Richard and I had been married for 38 years. We built our life in Dallas brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. We raised Ethan in the very house where we sat that evening. Every room carried a memory. The marks on the kitchen doorway still measured Ethan's height from elementary school through high school. The oak tree outside the dining room window was one Richard planted the year Ethan was born. Every corner of that home held a piece of our story. Yet as I sat there listening to Vanessa's words, I felt like a stranger inside my own history. Earlier that evening, everything had seemed ordinary enough. Vanessa had insisted we gather for a family dinner. She said it would help everyone heal. She used soft words and sympathetic smiles. She even squeezed my hand when she arrived. Looking back, I think she was rehearsing. Ethan barely spoke during the meal. He pushed food around his plate and stared at nothing. Grief had changed him. Or perhaps something else had changed him long before Richard died. At the time, I couldn't tell the difference. The dining room felt unusually quiet despite the clinking silverware. Richard's empty chair sat at the head of the table. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. Its absence spoke loudly enough. Every few minutes my eyes drifted toward it. I kept expecting to hear his laugh or one of his terrible jokes that somehow always made me smile. Instead, there was only silence. Then Vanessa set down her fork. She leaned back in her chair and exchanged a glance with Ethan. It lasted less than a second, but something about it made my stomach tighten. "We've been talking a lot about the future," she said. Her voice was smooth and measured. I nodded politely. "That's good," I replied. "Planning ahead is important." She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind people wear when they already know the outcome of a conversation. "Exactly," she said. "And honestly, this house represents a lot of opportunities." I looked around the room. "Your father loved this house," I said softly to Ethan. He didn't answer. Vanessa folded her hands together. "Richard did a great job building a foundation for the next generation." The next generation. The phrase lingered in the air. Then came the sentence. Calm. Precise. Almost casual. "This is our future now, not yours." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. The room seemed to narrow around me. Even the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder. I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to laugh awkwardly and tell me she didn't mean it that way. Instead, he stared down at his plate. My chest felt strangely hollow. Not broken. Not yet. Just empty. "I see," I said quietly. Vanessa nodded as though we had reached an agreement. The conversation moved on, but I barely heard another word. Inside, something had shifted. Not shattered. Shifted. Like a lock quietly turning. Later that night, after they left, I walked through the house alone. I touched the back of Richard's chair. I straightened a framed photograph on the mantel. I stood in our bedroom and looked at the reading glasses he had left on the nightstand the week before he passed away. The house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. I should have cried. Instead, I felt something colder than sadness. Questions. Why would Vanessa say that? Why would Ethan remain silent? What conversations had happened behind closed doors while I was busy grieving the man I loved? Near midnight, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea. That's when I noticed something unusual among the stack of mail. An envelope from a bank downtown. A bank Richard rarely used. My hands froze above it. I stared at the return address for several seconds. Then I slowly picked it up. What I discovered the next morning would change everything I thought I knew about my husband, my family, and the future Vanessa believed already belonged to her. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, although I could not remember sleeping. The envelope from the bank sat on the kitchen counter exactly where I had left it. A pale strip of morning light stretched across the granite surface, illuminating the unfamiliar logo printed in the corner. I made coffee out of habit, but after one sip I set the mug aside. It tasted like nothing. For 38 years, Richard had started every morning before me. He always claimed the first cup of coffee belonged to the person willing to get out of bed earliest. The silence in the kitchen felt heavier without him. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the envelope, wondering why he had never mentioned that bank. Richard was not a secretive man. At least, I had never believed he was. Eventually, I slipped the envelope into my purse, grabbed my car keys, and drove downtown. Dallas was already waking up. Commuters filled the highways. Delivery trucks moved through intersections. Life continued with its usual determination, indifferent to loss. The bank occupied the ground floor of a modern glass building near the business district. It looked expensive and understated at the same time. Inside, everything was polished stone, quiet voices, and carefully arranged furniture. I approached the reception desk and gave the woman my name. The moment she entered it into her computer, her expression changed slightly. Not alarm. Recognition. She picked up a phone and spoke softly before offering me a professional smile. "Mrs. Sullivan, someone will be with you shortly." A few minutes later, a man in a navy suit appeared and introduced himself as Daniel Harper. He could not have been much older than Ethan. He led me into a private office overlooking the city skyline. The room felt strangely formal for what I assumed would be a simple conversation. First, he said gently, "Please accept our condolences regarding your husband." I thanked him and sat down. My hands remained folded in my lap. Daniel opened a file and glanced at several documents before looking back at me. "Your husband left specific instructions for us," he said. Instructions that were to be carried out only after his passing. My heartbeat quickened. "Instructions?" I asked. He nodded. "Mr. Sullivan visited this office several times during the last 3 years. 3 years. The number caught my attention immediately. Richard had never mentioned any of those visits. Daniel slid a sealed folder across the desk. My name was written on the front in Richard's handwriting. I recognized every curve of every letter. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing a voice I thought had disappeared forever. "Take your time," Daniel said quietly. I opened the folder carefully. Inside was a letter. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to explain things myself. I know you. Right now you are probably confused, maybe even frustrated. But before you worry, I need you to trust me one last time." I stopped reading for a moment and pressed my lips together. It felt exactly like Richard speaking. Calm. Patient. Certain. I continued. "Over the past few years, I noticed things that concerned me. Conversations that ended when I entered a room. Decisions being discussed without you. Assumptions about what would happen after I was gone. I prayed I was wrong, but I prepared just in case." My chest tightened. Daniel remained silent while I read. Richard explained that he had created several legal protections to ensure I would always have financial independence. There were accounts, property rights, and documents structured specifically in my name. Everything had been reviewed by attorneys and financial advisors. Every detail had been arranged years before his illness became serious. Tears blurred the page briefly. Not because of the money. Because even at the end of his life, Richard had still been trying to protect me. I thought about Vanessa's words at dinner. I thought about Ethan's silence. Suddenly their confidence made a little more sense. They believed they understood the future. They believed every piece of the board was already in place. Daniel opened another file. "There is more," he said carefully. He explained several assets that I had never known existed. Nothing extravagant. Nothing unbelievable. But enough to ensure I would never depend on anyone else's generosity. Enough to make my own choices. Enough to remain exactly where I wanted to be. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside and stood on the sidewalk for several moments. The city moved around me in a blur of traffic and sunlight. For the first time since Richard's memorial service, I felt something other than grief. It was not relief. It was not happiness. It was clarity. Richard had seen something coming long before I did. And now I needed to figure out exactly what he had seen. As I walked toward my car, my phone vibrated. A text message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. Hope your appointment went well. Ethan and I were talking about some changes around the house tonight. We will discuss them over dinner. I read the message twice. Then I looked up at the bright Texas sky and slipped the phone back into my purse without replying. Something told me dinner was about to become far more interesting than Vanessa expected. When I arrived home that afternoon, the house looked exactly the same as it had every day for the past 20 years. The brick exterior glowed under the Texas sun. The oak tree Richard planted still stretched its branches over the front lawn. The wind chimes near the porch moved gently in the breeze. Nothing appeared different, yet everything felt different to me. For the first time, I was looking at my surroundings through Richard's eyes. He had noticed things. He had prepared for things. And now I was beginning to understand why. I walked inside and placed my purse on the kitchen counter. The silence greeted me immediately. For years, I had associated silence with peace. Lately, it felt more like a warning. I moved slowly through the house, paying attention to details I had ignored before. The family photographs lining the hallway remained in place, but I noticed something strange in Ethan and Vanessa's recent pictures. Vanessa was always standing slightly in front. It was subtle, easy to dismiss. Yet once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. Every image seemed to tell the same story. She was leading. Ethan was following. Around 5 o'clock, I heard their car pull into the driveway. A few moments later, the front door opened. Vanessa entered first, carrying several shopping bags. Ethan followed behind her, looking exhausted. Neither seemed surprised to find me sitting at the kitchen table. "How was your appointment?" Vanessa asked cheerfully as she set the bags on the counter. I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Productive." She smiled. "That sounds promising." Then she exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. It was the same look I had seen during dinner the night before. A silent conversation happening in plain sight. Ethan loosened his tie and opened the refrigerator. "We should probably talk tonight," he said without looking at me. "About some things moving forward." Moving forward. Another phrase that sounded harmless until you listened carefully. "Of course," I replied. "I would love to hear your thoughts." For a brief second, surprise crossed Vanessa's face. Perhaps she had expected resistance. Perhaps she had expected tears. Instead, I stood up and began preparing dinner. The evening unfolded quietly. We ate baked chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. Nobody mentioned Richard. Nobody mentioned grief. The absence of his name felt louder than any conversation. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa placed her napkin beside her plate and cleared her throat. "We have been discussing some practical matters," she began. "The house is very large for one person." I nodded. "It is. And maintenance costs keep increasing." Another nod. "That is true." She seemed encouraged by my agreement. There are excellent communities designed specifically for seniors. Beautiful places with activities, transportation, and social events. I noticed Ethan staring at his plate again. He had developed a habit of avoiding eye contact whenever difficult subjects appeared. "That sounds lovely," I said. Vanessa smiled. "I knew you would understand." Then Ethan finally spoke. "It might be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. Not better for me. Easier for everyone. The distinction mattered. I folded my hands together and listened. For the next 15 minutes, they outlined a future they had apparently discussed many times. Smaller living arrangements. Reduced responsibilities. A simpler lifestyle. Every suggestion conveniently ended with them remaining in the house. Neither one asked what I wanted. Neither one asked whether I was ready. They spoke as though the decision had already been made and they were merely introducing me to it. Richard had been right. The assumptions had already begun long before he passed away. After dinner, I carried my dishes into the kitchen. As I stood at the sink, I overheard Vanessa speaking softly in the hallway. "She is taking this much better than I expected," she whispered. I froze. Ethan's response was too quiet to hear clearly. Vanessa laughed softly. "A few more weeks and everything should be settled." A few more weeks. The words echoed in my mind. I continued washing dishes as though I had heard nothing. Later that evening, I went upstairs and entered Richard's study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across his desk. I sat in his leather chair and opened one of the drawers. Inside were neatly organized folders, notebooks, and receipts. Richard had always believed important things belonged on paper. As I carefully sorted through the contents, my fingers brushed against a small envelope hidden beneath a stack of documents. My name was written across the front in his handwriting once again. My heart began to pound. Slowly, I lifted the envelope into the light. Whatever was inside, Richard had intended for me to find it only when the time was right. And somehow I knew that time had finally arrived. For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope resting in my hands. The room around me seemed to disappear. Outside the study window, the branches of the oak tree moved gently in the night breeze, casting shifting shadows across Richard's desk. I ran my fingers over my name written in his familiar handwriting. The letters were steady and confident, exactly as I remembered. Richard had never rushed anything. Not conversations. Not decisions. Not promises. Taking a slow breath, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter and a small brass key attached to a plain white card. The sight of the key immediately puzzled me. Richard had never mentioned it. I unfolded the letter carefully. "Margaret, if you have found this, then you are beginning to see what I saw. I wish I had been wrong. More than anything, I wish I had been wrong." I paused and read the sentence again. Richard was not a suspicious man. During nearly 4 decades of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times I had seen him genuinely distrust someone. If he had written those words, he must have had a reason. I continued reading. Over the last several years, I noticed changes that troubled me. Small things at first. Conversations stopping when I entered a room. Plans being made without including you. Assumptions about this house and our future. I never wanted to burden you with my concerns, but I documented everything just in case. My heart tightened. Documented everything. The phrase lingered in my mind. Richard went on to explain that the brass key belonged to a private safe deposit box held under his name. Inside, he had placed copies of important records, letters, and notes. He instructed me not to open it immediately. Instead, he wanted me to watch carefully first. Listen carefully. Understand who people truly were when they believed nobody was paying attention. By the time I reached the end of the letter, tears had gathered in my eyes. Not because of fear, because I could hear his voice in every sentence. Calm, methodical, protective. Even after his death, he was still trying to guide me. I folded the letter and sat quietly in his chair. Memories began surfacing one after another. Richard standing in the driveway teaching Ethan how to ride a bicycle. Richard spending entire weekends building bookshelves in the study. Richard squeezing my hand during difficult times and reminding me that panic never solved anything. Looking back, I realized there had been moments during the past few years when he seemed distracted, thoughtful, almost concerned. At the time, I assumed it was work or age or the ordinary worries that come with life. Now I wondered if he had already begun noticing things I missed. The next morning I carried on as usual. I made breakfast. I watered the flowers near the kitchen window. I read the newspaper. When Vanessa came downstairs, I greeted her with the same polite smile I always used. If she noticed anything different, she did not show it. Around noon, while I was organizing old photographs in the living room, the doorbell rang. Standing on the front porch was my longtime neighbor, Carol Bennett. Carol had lived next door for nearly 15 years. She and Richard often talked over the fence while working in their yards. She held a small container of homemade cookies in her hands. "I was baking and thought you might like some company," she said warmly. I invited her inside. We sat at the kitchen table drinking iced tea. For a while we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, gardening, community events. Then Carol grew unusually quiet. She stared into her glass before finally looking up at me. Margaret, there is something I have been debating whether to tell you. The seriousness in her voice immediately caught my attention. What is it? I asked gently. Carol hesitated. A few weeks before Richard passed away, I overheard a conversation. My pulse quickened. She continued carefully. Vanessa was outside talking on her phone. I was watering my roses. She did not realize I was nearby. Carol looked uncomfortable. She was discussing renovation ideas for this house. Extensive renovations. She spoke as though moving in permanently was already decided. I remained silent. Carol studied my face. What bothered me was not the renovations. It was the certainty. She talked as if ownership was only a matter of time. A chill moved through me. Richard's concerns. Vanessa's confidence. Ethan's silence. For the first time, the pieces were beginning to form a picture. And the more clearly that picture emerged, the more determined I became to discover what was waiting inside that safe deposit box. The following morning, I drove back downtown with the brass key resting inside my purse. The sky above Dallas was clear and bright, but my thoughts felt heavier than they had in weeks. Richard had always believed that truth revealed itself slowly. Looking back, I realized he had spent years preparing me for this moment without ever saying so directly. The bank lobby was quieter than before. Daniel Harper greeted me immediately and escorted me to a secure area near the back of the building. After verifying my identification, he opened a steel door and led me into a private room. A few moments later, he returned carrying a small metal box. He placed it on the table between us. "This is the safe deposit box your husband instructed us to release only to you," he said. My hands felt strangely cold as I inserted the brass key. The lock clicked softly. For a second, I hesitated. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were several folders, a leather notebook, and a sealed envelope marked "Open Last." Everything was organized with Richard's usual precision. I reached for the notebook first. The cover showed signs of wear, as though he had carried it frequently. As I opened it, I immediately recognized his handwriting. The entries stretched across several years. They were not emotional observations. They were facts. Dates, conversations, incidents, small details that seemed insignificant alone but troubling together. One entry described Vanessa discussing renovation plans with a contractor nearly 18 months earlier. Another mentioned Ethan asking unusually specific questions about property transfers and inheritance laws. Richard had recorded everything calmly and objectively. He never accused anyone of wrongdoing. He simply documented what he observed. The deeper I read, the more unsettled I became. There were notes about family dinners where decisions had been discussed without including me. Notes about conversations that stopped abruptly when either Richard or I entered a room. Notes about assumptions being made regarding future ownership of the house. What shocked me most was not the content itself. It was how long it had been happening. Richard had noticed the pattern years before I did. Beneath the notebook sat several legal documents. Daniel helped explain them. Richard had worked with attorneys to create protections that could not easily be challenged or altered. The house remained entirely under my control. Additional financial accounts had been structured with similar safeguards. Every arrangement reflected the same goal: independence, security, choice. Richard had not been preparing for an argument. He had been protecting my ability to live my life on my own terms. Then I opened the final folder. Inside was a property appraisal dated 8 months earlier. The estimated value of the house was significantly higher than I expected. Suddenly many things began making sense. The frequent discussions about space, the comments about downsizing, the sudden interest in my future living arrangements. This was never only about concern. There was a financial incentive attached to every suggestion. I sat quietly for several moments staring at the papers. Grief had clouded my judgment after Richard passed away. I had been so focused on surviving each day that I failed to notice what was happening around me. Now the fog was beginning to lift. Before leaving, I finally opened the envelope marked "Open Last." Inside was a single handwritten page. Margaret, if you have reached this point, then you already know enough to see the truth for yourself. Do not act out of anger. Do not argue. Do not rush. Listen more than you speak. Let people reveal themselves. The truth always becomes louder when nobody interrupts it. I smiled despite the tears gathering in my eyes. That sounded exactly like Richard. Patient. Thoughtful. Wise. When I returned home later that afternoon, I found Vanessa sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through real estate listings on her tablet. She quickly minimized the screen when she saw me enter. "How was your day?" she asked casually. I placed my purse on the counter and smiled. Very informative. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. It vanished almost instantly. But I saw it. For the first time, I truly saw it. Vanessa believed she understood the game being played inside this house. What she did not realize was that Richard had left behind an entire set of rules she knew nothing about. And now, for the first time since his passing, I was ready to start following them. Over the next several days, I followed Richard's advice exactly. I listened more than I spoke. I observed more than I reacted. The strange thing about silence is that people eventually begin filling it with information. When they believe you are no longer paying attention, they become careless. Vanessa certainly did. Every morning she moved through the house with increasing confidence. She measured walls. She talked about furniture arrangements. She discussed paint colors that had never existed in this home while Richard was alive. At first, she tried to disguise those conversations as harmless ideas. Then she stopped bothering. One afternoon, I walked into the family room and found several design magazines spread across the coffee table. Certain pages had been folded and marked with notes. Master's Suite Renovation. Open Concept Kitchen. Home Office Expansion. I quietly picked one up and examined it. Vanessa appeared a moment later carrying a cup of coffee. "Just gathering inspiration," she said with a smile. "You know how much planning goes into these things. These things. Not possibilities. Not dreams. Plans." I simply nodded and returned the magazine to the table. Her confidence grew stronger every day. Ethan worried me more. He seemed trapped somewhere between guilt and surrender. Sometimes I caught him staring at family photographs with an expression I could not quite understand. Other times he repeated Vanessa's opinions as though they were his own. The son who once questioned everything now questioned nothing. One evening I sat on the back patio watching the sunset fade across the Texas sky. The oak tree Richard planted cast long shadows across the yard. Ethan stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to me and sat down beside me. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence felt familiar. Years ago we used to sit exactly like this after his baseball games or school events. Back when conversations came easily. "Mom," he finally said, "have you thought any more about simplifying things?" I looked toward the yard. "What do you mean by simplifying?" He shifted uncomfortably. "A smaller place. Less responsibility. Maybe a community where you could meet people your own age." There it was again. The carefully rehearsed language. The same phrases. The same suggestions. "Do you think I am unhappy here?" I asked. Ethan hesitated. "No, do you think I am incapable of managing my affairs?" Another hesitation. "No, then why does everyone seem so eager to decide where I belong?" He looked away. For a moment I thought he might answer honestly. Instead, he stood up and brushed imaginary dust from his pants. "We just want what is best for you." Then he went back inside. I remained on the patio long after darkness settled across the yard. Richard had documented facts. Carol had shared observations. The bank records had revealed preparations. Yet part of me still hoped I was misunderstanding something. That hope disappeared 3 days later. It happened by accident. I had returned from grocery shopping earlier than expected. As I entered through the garage door, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Vanessa was speaking on the phone. She had not noticed me. "The timing is actually working out perfectly," she said. "Once everything is finalized, the property value alone will more than justify the renovation budget." I stopped moving. My grocery bags remained in my hands. "No, she is cooperating," Vanessa continued. "Honestly, I expected more resistance. But she seems ready to move on." A brief pause followed. Then she laughed softly. The house practically belongs to us already. The words landed with surprising clarity. Not because they shocked me. Because they confirmed everything. Every assumption. Every conversation. Every note Richard had written. I quietly stepped back into the garage before she could see me. A younger version of myself might have confronted her immediately. A younger version of myself might have demanded explanations. Instead, I loaded the groceries back into my car and drove to a nearby park. I sat beneath a large shade tree overlooking a small pond and thought about Richard's final instructions. Do not rush. Let people reveal themselves. For the first time, I understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa was no longer hiding her intentions. She believed victory was inevitable, and that belief was making her careless. As the afternoon sun reflected across the water, my phone vibrated with a new message. It was from Daniel Harper. The subject line contained only 6 words. Additional documents have been located. My heart began to pound as I opened the message. Whatever Richard had left behind, it was apparently much bigger than I had realized. The next morning, I returned to the bank earlier than usual. Daniel Harper was waiting for me in the same private office overlooking the city. The expression on his face told me this was not a routine follow-up. He placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward me. These documents were stored separately, he explained. Your husband instructed us to release them only if certain circumstances developed. I slowly opened the folder. Inside were additional legal records, correspondence with attorneys, and several signed statements. Richard had been thorough. More thorough than I ever imagined. As I reviewed the pages, a pattern emerged. He had anticipated pressure. He had anticipated manipulation. He had even anticipated specific attempts to persuade me to leave the house voluntarily. Every document reinforced the same principle. The final decision would always remain mine. Nobody could force it. Nobody could quietly maneuver around it. Nobody could simply wait me out. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not because of the paperwork itself, but because it reminded me who Richard had been. He was never the loudest man in the room. He did not dominate conversations or demand attention. He simply prepared. While other people argued about possibilities, Richard quietly built solutions. Daniel pointed toward one final section. There is something else you should know, he said. He explained that Richard had arranged for periodic reviews of certain property records and financial activities connected to the estate. Nothing improper had occurred. Everything was legal. But the records revealed repeated inquiries about ownership timelines and future transfer procedures. The dates stretched back nearly 2 years. Long before Richard's health had seriously declined. Long before anyone should have been discussing inheritances. I sat silently for several moments. The realization hurt more than I expected. It was one thing to discover greed. It was another to discover how long it had existed. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about Ethan as a little boy. I remembered helping him with science projects at the kitchen table. I remembered sitting in the front row during school concerts. I remembered the way he used to run toward me after baseball games, whether his team won or lost. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared. Or perhaps he had simply stopped listening to the right voices. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed an unfamiliar luxury SUV parked in front of the house. Through the front window, I could see people gathered in the living room. My pulse quickened. I entered quietly. Vanessa stood near the fireplace speaking with a sharply dressed man carrying a leather portfolio. Ethan sat nearby. Both looked surprised to see me arrive so soon. Margaret, Vanessa said with forced enthusiasm, perfect timing. The man extended his hand. Thomas Grayson. Real estate consultant. Consultant. Not friend. Not neighbor. Not casual visitor. Consultant. I smiled politely and shook his hand. What exactly are you consulting on? An uncomfortable silence followed. Vanessa recovered first. We are only exploring options. Nothing official. Thomas opened his portfolio and quickly closed it again. Even from several feet away, I recognized architectural renderings and property estimates. Renovation plans. The same future they had been discussing for months. Perhaps years. How interesting, I said calmly. I was under the impression this house was not currently on the market. Ethan shifted in his chair. Vanessa laughed lightly. Of course it is not. We are simply being proactive. Proactive. Another carefully chosen word. I nodded and excused myself. As I walked upstairs, I could feel their confusion. They expected questions. They expected concern. They expected resistance. Instead, I gave them none of those things. Later that evening, after the consultant left, Vanessa appeared unusually cheerful. She moved around the kitchen humming softly while preparing dinner. Confidence radiated from her. She truly believed events were moving in her favor. During the meal, she casually mentioned timelines, future possibilities, long-term plans. Every sentence assumed the same outcome. I listened quietly. Richard's words echoed in my mind. Let people reveal themselves. The truth always becomes louder when nobody interrupts it. By the end of dinner, Vanessa had revealed more than she realized. And for the first time, I began to see exactly how the final confrontation would unfold. What she did not know was that the most important document Richard left behind had not yet been shown to anyone. Not even me. The following week unfolded with an almost unsettling calm. Vanessa continued acting as though the future had already been decided. Ethan drifted through each day carrying the quiet uncertainty of a man who had stopped asking difficult questions. And I continued listening, watching, waiting. Richard's final lesson required patience, and patience had become my greatest advantage. 3 days after the visit from the real estate consultant, Vanessa announced that she wanted to host a family meeting. She presented the idea as something practical and necessary. According to her, everyone needed clarity about the future. The moment she said it, I knew exactly what was coming. The meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon in the living room. By 2 o'clock, several relatives had arrived. Ethan's cousin Michael sat near the fireplace. My sister-in-law Denise occupied her usual chair beside the window. Vanessa moved around the room offering coffee and refreshments with the confidence of someone preparing for a celebration rather than a discussion. I sat quietly on the sofa beneath the family photographs. Richard's portrait rested on the mantel above us. Sometimes I caught myself glancing toward it. Somehow his steady smile still felt reassuring. Once everyone settled into their seats, Vanessa cleared her throat. Thank you all for coming, she began. We want to discuss some important decisions regarding the house and future planning. Future planning. The phrase sounded familiar now. She spoke for nearly 15 minutes. She described the challenges of maintaining a large property. She discussed rising costs and practical considerations. She explained how beneficial it could be for me to move somewhere smaller and more convenient. Her presentation was polished, thoughtful, reasonable on the surface. Yet every path she described ended at the same destination, the house remaining with her and Ethan. When she finished, several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody seemed eager to comment. Finally, Vanessa turned toward me with a sympathetic smile. Margaret, we all care about you. We simply want what is best. I noticed Ethan watching me carefully. He appeared nervous. Perhaps he expected resistance. Perhaps he expected tears. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and smiled gently. That is very kind, I said. Relief immediately appeared on Vanessa's face. She mistook calmness for agreement. It was a mistake she had been making for months. I am glad you understand, she replied. Then she reached into a folder beside her chair and removed several papers. These are preliminary documents. Nothing official. Just a starting point. The room grew noticeably quieter. I looked at the papers without touching them. Then I looked at Ethan. Have you read these? I asked. He hesitated before nodding. Most of them. Most of them. Not all. That answer told me more than he realized. Before anyone could continue, the doorbell rang. Vanessa frowned slightly. Were we expecting someone? Nobody answered. A moment later, another knock sounded through the house. Calmly, I stood and walked toward the front door. When I opened it, Daniel Harper stood on the porch holding a slim leather portfolio. Behind him was an older attorney I recognized from the documents Richard had prepared years earlier. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Daniel offered a polite smile. "Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for inviting us." The living room fell completely silent as they entered. Confusion spread across several faces. Vanessa looked particularly unsettled. The attorney took a seat and carefully opened his portfolio. Before any decisions are discussed, he said calmly, "There are several estate matters that need clarification." I returned to my seat without saying a word. One by one, documents were placed on the coffee table. Property records, legal protections, estate directives. Every page carried Richard's signature. Every page reinforced the same truth. Control of the house remained entirely with me. Future decisions belonged entirely to me. No transfer could occur without my direct authorization. No assumptions held any legal weight. As the explanation continued, Vanessa's confidence slowly disappeared. Ethan stared at the documents in stunned silence. Around the room, relatives exchanged increasingly surprised looks. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The facts spoke for themselves. When the attorney finally closed the portfolio, an almost tangible stillness settled over the room. Vanessa looked as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. And for the first time since Richard passed away, the future no longer belonged to assumptions. It belonged to the truth. The only thing remaining was the final document Richard had prepared, the one nobody in that room had seen yet, the one Daniel carefully kept separate from everything else. Nobody moved for several seconds after the attorney finished speaking. The room felt suspended in time. Vanessa stared at the documents spread across the coffee table as though they might somehow rearrange themselves into a different reality. Ethan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Around us, family members exchanged uncertain glances, each trying to process what had just happened. Then Daniel Harper reached into his portfolio and removed a single sealed envelope. Unlike the other documents, this one looked personal. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. The sight of it immediately softened something inside me. Even after everything that had happened, seeing his handwriting still felt like hearing his voice. Daniel handed me the envelope. "Your husband left instructions that this letter be read only after the estate matters were fully clarified," he said. Carefully, I opened it. The paper inside contained only one page. The room remained completely silent as I began reading. "Margaret, if this letter is being opened, then the truth has finally reached the surface. I know this process may have been painful, and I am sorry you had to experience it. But I also know something about you that others sometimes forget. You are stronger than anyone realizes. You always have been." I paused for a moment. Tears blurred the words briefly before I continued. "I spent nearly 4 decades watching you build a family, support people you loved, and put the needs of others ahead of your own. If anyone deserves the freedom to choose her future, it is you. That freedom belongs to nobody else. Not to me. Not to Ethan. Not to anyone. The decision is yours alone." I lowered the letter slightly. The room felt different now. Not tense. Not hostile. Simply honest. For months, perhaps years, assumptions had filled this house. Now those assumptions were gone. Only truth remained. I finished reading the final paragraph silently. When I folded the letter and placed it in my lap, nobody spoke. Eventually Vanessa cleared her throat. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Margaret, I think perhaps there has been a misunderstanding." I looked at her calmly. A few weeks earlier, that sentence might have provoked anger. Now it only sounded tired. "No," I replied gently. "I think there has been a misunderstanding for a very long time. It just was not mine." Ethan finally raised his eyes. For the first time in months, I saw genuine emotion there. Not confidence. Not avoidance. Regret. "Mom," he said quietly, "I never wanted to hurt you." The sadness in his voice was real. So was the damage. "I know," I answered. "That is what makes this so difficult." Nobody argued after that. There was nothing left to argue about. Facts do not need defending. They simply exist. One by one, relatives began leaving. Quiet goodbyes replaced awkward conversations. Eventually only Ethan, Vanessa, and I remained. The house felt strangely peaceful. The tension that had shadowed every room since Richard's passing seemed to be dissolving. Later that evening, I stood alone on the back patio watching the sunset settle over the yard. The oak tree swayed gently in the warm Texas breeze. The same tree Richard planted the year Ethan was born. The same tree that had witnessed birthdays, holidays, celebrations, and heartbreaks. Behind me, the screen door opened. Ethan stepped outside. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he sat beside me. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I looked toward the horizon where the last traces of sunlight painted the sky gold. "Now," I said, "people start being honest." He nodded slowly. Neither of us needed to say more. Some wounds heal through conversation. Others heal through time. In the months that followed, I made my own decisions. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. The house remained mine because Richard wanted me to have that choice. Eventually, I chose to stay. Not because of property values or legal protections. Because it was home. Vanessa and Ethan moved into a place of their own the following spring. The distance gave everyone room to reflect. Relationships changed. Some grew stronger. Some never fully recovered. That is the nature of truth. It reveals what was already there. Sometimes people ask me whether I resent what happened. The answer surprises them. I do not. Resentment requires carrying a burden long after it serves a purpose. I carried enough burdens already. Instead, I remember the lesson Richard left behind. Listen carefully. Watch patiently. Let people reveal themselves. The future never belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the person willing to protect it. And in the end, the future they thought was theirs had been mine all along.